Hey everyone, finally, chapter 18. So for chapter 18, we will be looking at general functions and characteristics of the autonomic nervous system, which I will do in this video. And then I'll look a little bit more specifically at the anatomy of the two divisions, which are the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And then finally, finish off with this concept of dual innervation, which by the time you get to that last concept, it becomes fairly obvious by the time we get there. Okay, so the autonomic nervous system. It is synonymous with autonomic motor system. Synonymous meaning it means the same thing. So autonomic nervous system means the same thing as autonomic motor. So motor meaning this is not sensory information that is carried in this system at all. It's going down. It's going from central nervous system down and out to the body. It is not visceral sensory. So we talked about visceral sensory way back when we started this unit. And visceral sensory would be information coming into the brain, things like what your blood pressure is, what's the state of your digestive system. We're not going to do any visceral sensory past what we've already done, which is mention that it exists. But we will do a fair amount of autonomic motor. So before we start that autonomic motor, the more specifics, I wanted to contrast it with somatic motor. So somatic motor, hopefully you recall somatic, refers to voluntary information that you consciously control, like you want to move your hand, you send that information to your hand to move. Whereas the ANS or autonomic nervous system is involuntary, things that you do not consciously control. So the target for somatic motor would be skeletal muscle. You know already that your skeletal muscle is voluntary, whereas the target for the autonomic nervous system is cardiac muscle, so your heart, and smooth muscle. And you remember smooth muscle is in lots of internal organs like your bladder and your intestines and blood vessels and so forth. Also, another target of the autonomic nervous system is glands. So for instance, sweat glands. How do your sweat glands know when it's time to start sweating? The autonomic nervous system will send them a signal saying it's time to go. And there's plenty of other glands. Digestive system and some endocrine glands as well are affected by autonomic or innervated and get their signal from an autonomic nervous system. Excitation only. What that means is that somatic motor, it'll only send the signal go. It will tell your skeletal muscle to do its thing. If the skeletal muscle doesn't receive any signal, it doesn't contract. It's in a relaxed state. So all you need to do is tell your skeletal muscle go. That's very different actually from cardiac and smooth. Cardiac in particular, and we'll get into this in the next unit when we talk about the heart, they kind of go on their own and can do their own thing. What the autonomic nervous system does is either tell it to go or to slow down. So actually a better way than go might be speed up. Speed up your heartbeat, that would be excitation, or inhibition is slow down. So ANS can do both, excitation through the nervous system or inhibition. So the nervous system, we didn't talk about this very much, but when we have that is just horrible. I'm going to start that all over again. Sorry. Oh, maybe it's not going to let me. Okay. So you remember we had our star-shaped neuron thrown cell body, and we've got our axon and the axon terminals at the end, or the telodendria at the end and the little synaptic knobs. And I said it dumps a neurotransmitter right into the synaptic cleft, and it makes something else, whatever target is here. And that target could be another neuron, could be a gland, could be a muscle, and imply that it sent the signal over. And I think the implication is always it tells the target to go. And that would be excitation. But in fact, in the nervous system, you can have excitation or you can have inhibition. It can tell this next neuron, for instance, not to fire instead of fire. So either of these is possible in the nervous system. Okay, there are some differences in the anatomy. You have your first neuron starts in your brain. It actually starts in the primary motor cortex, which is in the precentral gyrus of the brain, way up there when we learned about in chapter 15. And that neuron starts there in the frontal lobe, goes down your spinal cord, and it stops at some spinal cord level. It depends. If it was going to the upper limb, it would stop somewhere in cervical region, probably lower cervical region, and go through this second neuron would go out into the peripheral nervous system through the brachial plexus, and it would go and synapse on, say, your biceps brachii. So there's two neurons. The one that starts in the brain talks to the one in the spinal cord. The one in the spinal cord then goes out to the muscle. Oh, it's kind of obscured there, but there's also a 2-neuron chain in the autonomic nervous system. The first neuron we call the preganglionic, right there. And then the second neuron we call the postganglionic. So there is a ganglion in between. Actually, the ganglion would be right here. That's our G. Oh, and this would be our post. The location of the pre and the post, it varies. 2-neuron chain, a little more specifics. Preganglionic neuron, the first one in the chain, that's our first neuron. This cell body, which would be the star-shaped thing I drew earlier, but I don't want to draw again. This particular cell body, actually I want to change colors. This cell body that I'm labeling here is somewhere in the CNS. And CNS, brain, or spinal cord. Then the second neuron, the postganglionic neuron, its cell body, let me draw the postganglionic first. Postganglionic cell body is somewhere in the PNS. So this one is in the PNS. Cell bodies in the PNS are always in ganglia. Remember, cell bodies, gray matter. Or I'm going to put ganglion, or ganglia would be plural, one or the other. Remember, these cell bodies mean gray matter. Gray matter in the PNS is always in a ganglion, which actually, that's a lot of G's. Ganglion, gray matter, cell bodies. Okay. So, I should indicate to you what that is, what I'm referring to there in italices. Sometimes the second one is also called the ganglionic neuron because its cell body is in the ganglion. And I think your book refers to either. Postganglionic is also a term that is used. I prefer it. I prefer post simply because pre-post. It's just helpful in the 2-neuron chain to know pre must be the first one, post must be the second one. But this term is also used for the second one sometimes. It's not as friendly, I don't think, to me. It's not as friendly to learn as post. Okay. Another thing I just wanted to note really quickly, not all the fibers are myelinated in the autonomic nervous system. So remember, myelin is what wraps around, this wrapping's kind of big, wraps around your axons of the neurons. Not all of them are myelinated, which means the ANS is relatively slow. The autonomic nervous system is not fast. The somatic, actually the voluntary, is faster. The signal reaches your muscle much faster in some cases than an autonomic signal.